Robert Taylor, hello.
Hello.
Would you like to tell me a bit about where you were born and grew up?
I was born right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1951, and I lived my entire life. My whole youth was in Tulsa, all the way up until 1969, when I went to school out of state, and then ended up in the Navy.
What are your tribal affiliations?
On my mother's side, I give everybody my whole amalgamation. On my mother's side, it's Osage, Cherokee, and Scotch. And on my father's side, it's Blackfoot, Crow, and Black Dutch.
Where in Tulsa did you go to school, and what kinds of school activities were you involved in?
I went to Will Rogers High School. I graduated in 1969. While in high school, I played football and baseball. And I received a scholarship to Central Missouri State, where I was injured before our illustrious bowl game, the Pecan Bowl. And they told me that football days were over, so I thought I didn't really like being in Missouri, so I decided to come back to Tulsa University, who had offered me a baseball scholarship. And in transition in between, Uncle Sam came knocking at the draft, so I joined the Navy.
Was art a part of your school activities at all?
My original formal training was 4th through 6th grade art at Andrew Jackson Elementary. While in the Navy, I had decided that I was going to write the great American novel. In my mind, it was going to be a literal documentary. And I discovered that people really weren't interested in that, but they enjoyed some of the doodles I do to illustrate. And when I got out of the Navy, I started pursuing art.
That's when you started pursuing it. Looking back now, what do you think some of the early influences on your art may have been?
The earliest influence that I can really remember, first off, would be my grandfather. Simply, he was the male role model. He was the one who really taught me a lot about living. He had a 3rd grade education and was one of probably the smartest men I've ever known. And one of my uncles, one of his sons, was Wallace Hughes, who was a wildlife artist, and he at that time was working for the state of Oklahoma, and he did wildlife work, and he did a lot of basically birds. And through him, to this day, I still doodle the same bald eagle that he originally taught me to draw when I was 6 years old. One of our family functions out while we were putting the watermelons in the water trough to cool them down, we had packing paper, wrapping paper stretched across these tables, and I asked him to teach me, and he showed me, he said, I can teach anybody to draw something. And he taught me this little eagle, and to this day I still do it. And I was fortunate enough to get to visit with him. He passed away in this past May, and I was visited with him just before that. I went down and visited with him, and I asked him if he remembered the day we were out there by the barn, and he taught me that, and he remembered. Without me coaching him, he remembered most of our conversation. That really impressed me. But he was a big influence. And my grandfather, who through his, just the way he actually lived his life, that's in all Native beliefs, all tribals around the world, true art is how you live your life. And my grandfather was a master at that. And in my real youth, he'd take me around to some of the powwows. And it was through him that I was really introduced to that side of my lineage. And then as I grew older, as a lot of urban Indians, that wasn't as cool as other things going on. And I really never gave thought of it until I was in the service. And that's when I started going back to remembering the things that my grandfather, the places he had taken me, the things he had taught me. One reason he passed away, the last time I saw him was the day I left for the service at the bus depot. And I always say that if there's one thing I'd change, I'd go back and have a lot more conversation with him. But through that, when I had a daughter, Mallory, wanted her to have a little of the same experience I had in youth. And it kind of took me back. I was surprised the impact it had on me going back to powwows. And luckily, Mallory took to it. She wanted to dance. And through that, discovered one of the women whose daughter helped Mallory learn to dance was the same woman. It was her land that we used to go to powwows when I was a little boy. We both used to laugh, saying we probably played with each other out there running around the field, making all the adults mad at us. So that was the big influence of my grandfather, and that early on.
I'm assuming we're talking about the Vietnam War, that you were in the service
Yes,
during that
I
time.
was in the Navy from 1970 until 1972. My ship that I was on was decommissioned.
So once you got out, that was when you sort of knew, based on the response you'd been getting, that you wanted to earn your living as an artist. Did you immediately begin painting full time? How did you negotiate that?
I had a panoply of jobs. I always laugh because I laugh at a couple of my good friends who hired me since that stage, off and on, doing things. One of them, Doris Little, who let me work in her gallery. And I was still, at that time, my desire was still the writing, but I was starting to pursue the art more. And then
Can you give me a ballpark time period too?
About 1973, 74, a friend of mine and three of us got involved. We opened a bar in Tulsa, and through that, we had a lot of free time, but it also gave us an income. That we built it up for 2 years. We had the bar, then we sold it, and that is when I decided, with what I made from that, and I still had some money saved from the Navy, that I needed to just develop what I wanted to do, and art was the way it really started to be the facilitator for me. I moved to Grand Lake and lived up there off on Monkey Island. At the time, there was nothing there but me and Shangri-La, and that's where I started working on trying to learn color.
I know that successful artists usually have a support system of some kind. What was your early support system like? And it might have changed over the years too, of course.
Well, it's about that panoply of jobs, which was barely getting me by. And at that time, I was really, probably a lot of my friends hated to see me show up with something in my hands because they knew I was going to give them something they had to hang up at that time, which was probably terrible because all the art I was doing, if you said you liked it, it was yours. Because I was still trying to learn. And so I wasn't really trying to go professional until actually I got involved with Susan Leggett, who became the mother of our daughter, and we got married. But it was her, she was the one who pushed me to become a full-time artist.
You've sort of already described your artistic training, which is mostly being self-taught. Did you take any workshops at any point, or?
After the Grand Lake, that's where Susan and I first really met each other. And when we moved back to Tulsa and we got married, she decided she let it slip that she thought I was getting better with color one day. She said that, and she'd never said anything to me before, and that's when she let me know that she'd been afraid that she'd had to live with all this other stuff I'd been painting up till that point. And then she said I thought I was getting better, and that maybe it would be a little bit faster along the road if I took a few classes.
So was your palette primarily sort of dark at that point, or was she?
Oh, it was very gaudy, very bright, very flat traditional too. It was all flat traditional style. Then it got even worse and busier when I started trying to join different styles to the flat. So I went into Tulsa Junior College and I took the art class there using my VA, and discovered that they were more interested in teaching me what to do than versus how to. And so I quit that.
In terms of trying to dictate content to you?
I was asked by the head of the art department, actually. Her name was Nodi Johnson, and that's who I had as an instructor. I still remember her name. Because one day she asked me why I always did savages. And that right there was the last day I attended that class. However, I went back to Tulsa Junior College a year later to take another class under a man by the name of Pat Gordon, who was a watercolorist in Tulsa, who I admired immensely on his ability and what he did. And after meeting him, he was really a good instructor. He spent most of his time teaching us how to do what we wanted to do. He asked us, and through him, I was introduced to color. And I should say the reason I was introduced to him was after my first experience, I decided private lessons. And there's an artist in Tulsa named Herb Raw. And Susan was a friend of Herb's wife, and that's how I met them. And through that, I found out he was classically trained in New York City as a portrait painter. And I asked him if he would teach me color. And he started oil paints. And I paid him, I think I was paying him $40 a week for 2 lessons a week. And I was able to paint one grisaille. He allowed me only black and white. He said if you wanted to learn color, I had to learn first the shades. So we would go black and white. I did one painting under his tutelage and my money ran out. But he told me then that I should pursue, he said Pat Gordon taught a class and that that's somebody I should check in with. And that's how I ended up. And I took 1 semester of Pat Gordon. And with the black and white training of her and Pat Gordon then teaching us a little bit about color values, that's been my whole official training.
What Indian art galleries were around at the time, and what galleries were you connected with at the start of your career, or were they even Indian galleries?
At the very beginning, I spent years of just painting, like I said, and occasionally some friends would ask to borrow, or I mean not borrow, buy a piece, and I'd charge them $20 for something, or maybe $5, family members. And Susan kept saying that if you're thinking you want to do this for a living, which I was working part-time jobs and trying to paint, that I should pursue it. And there's Western Heritage Gallery at that time. Even Noda, Johnson, I can't remember the last name, Neva and
Otis Wilson.
Otis Wilson of Western Heritage Gallery. And I walked in, to this day I always laugh, I walked in with 5 pieces. And I had 3 of them flat tradition. And 2 of them were basically wildlife paintings, but more expressionist. And I remember Otis looked at it and he talked to me, and this was in 1978, 79. And I remember he picked a 16 by 20 I had, and he held it up, and he goes, "So, you want to be an artist?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "So you plan on doing more paintings than these 5? And I said, "Yes." He says, "So you don't have to put everything you think on one canvas." And he held that one up in front. It was so busy and gaudy. He took the other 4 and told me to take that one home with me to always remember that. And through Otis, he contacted me a couple weeks later, told me he'd sold 3 of them. And nothing inspires an artist more than sales. So from that, I started working with Otis. And then when they decided to move town, Linda Griever, Art Market. And at that time, I'd been going in there off and on anyway, and there was an artist, Ben Harjo, who was working in the gallery. And I struck up conversations with Ben and learned a little bit, and decided to present myself to her. And I started dealing with Linda Griever, and that would have been probably like 1980, early 80s.
What about art shows or art competitions? When did you begin entering some of those?
I started entering the local competitive shows, real small shows. There used to be a small show up in Veneta. There was a couple of small shows around different places, and I started entering those, and I actually won a couple of them. And then I decided, with that under my belt, I approached the Trail of Tears show in Claremore, and that's the first major competitive show that I entered, and I entered that for several years.
Right, that was a major national Indian art show. In terms of awards that you've won?
I won several grand awards at these small shows, and that's what pushed me into trying to do the Trail of Tears show. And through that, I discovered that I started striking up friendship with some of the artists, and I met a few of those through Linda Griever, since that was basically strictly an Indian gallery. Through that, the prestige of that show continued me to entering it several years. And I garnered several awards, the Jerome Tyre Award, I won that twice. And then after several years of that, I decided to basically move on to competitive shows. I think they have their place, but I think the best place for them is for the younger artists starting out, as I was at that time. Because the one thing I've noticed about competitive shows, especially on the local level, if you are handed basically a roster who's in it, all of us who have been here long enough, if we see certain names, we know those people are going to win awards. And that's really nice, but it really dampens. I can remember when I first started out that it was that way at the Trail of Tears. I could list who was going to win the first 3 or 4 years. Then the year I finally won it, of course, I thought, well, this is a good deal. But I discovered that you keep plugging away. But it's one of the things that we reach a point. I think competitive shows serve their purpose up to a point.
What was the lay of the land in terms of Indian art at that time, in terms of what the media coverage was like, or what kinds of styles were popular? And I know it's hard to encapsulate all of that, but just...
Well, the 1980s is where I started to notice that I think all of us noticed the real interest. There's the resurgence of interest in the native and tribal thoughts. There's the tribes themselves garnished a lot more pride, and there was a lot of movements, and so there's a lot of media coverage on almost anything Indian at that time, and there was a lot of oil money, and for this local area, there's a lot of money being thrown around all of a sudden into the Indian art world, as though we had just been discovered. And the lay of the land at the time was that everybody realized that there was two basic collectors at that time, and they were the ones who had been around since the beginning of the historical side of what we used to call the elders and old timers. They were collecting their work, and they weren't really real appreciative of us trying to change the style. I preface that by saying basically by 1980, I was no longer doing anything flat traditional. It's more, I'd say my work's allegorical, but it's more expressionistic as far as the way it's presented. There was a group of younger artists, younger collectors and younger artists who were all starting to branch that way, and we were starting to push the fabric in the 80s. And I think that's what garnered Oklahoma's notoriety. I think we started in the late 70s into the 80s is when Oklahoma actually started surfacing as being something different versus most of the other native shows and native art. And I think that comes from the melting pot. Oklahoma's a melting pot because of the land run, but there's also a melting pot of tribes before the land run. All of our tribes, there was only 3 or 4 tribes originally in this area, but now we have all this congregation of so many tribal groups. And as anything, you're subject to your environment. So all kinds of things were traded. Songs, ceremonies, dress. It's just like now, starting in the 80s, if it's going to be Indian, there's going to be a lot of feathers flying everywhere. And that became the big thing, of everybody looking for. I guess that's I can wander and meander a lot about that. Is that because of that group of collectors though who started in the 80s and 90s, who were willing to see a change. And a lot of them were the children of major collectors of historical work of the elders, of our elders, they'd seen that, and they wanted to basically, they wanted the stories. Their parents had met A.C. Blue Eagle, they'd met Woody Crumbo, they met Rosa Tote, if you go back far enough. And they had those stories, and which, like anything, art's emotion, and it's supposed to have a story to it. I don't care if it's a painting of a flower, it has a story to it. And the younger group wanted those stories. Luckily, the bulk of Indian collectors across the breadth of the nation liked the stories that were coming out of Oklahoma artists, because we weren't really, I can get in trouble with this a lot, but we weren't as tied to tribal identity as a lot of the other artists were because of our environment. And also, I think there was a bigger movement that wasn't so much political in Oklahoma, that was more about maybe documenting actual heritage. And that means things had to be put down in black and white or color. They had to be documented beyond just the oral history. And Oklahoma artists started pushing those envelopes.
You've already sort of described for me a bit of the media that you began working in. For example, Pat Gordon was teaching mostly watercolors, is that correct?
Yes.
You were working, did mostly black and whites with her. Can you tell me what kind of medium you tend to prefer now?
I started out in watercolor, and I blended acrylic a little bit, and pen and ink became my mainstay all the way up until the early 1980s, when I went to Oklahoma City and I saw a Paul Plitka show. And I'd seen a couple of his pieces. He's a New Mexico painter. I had seen some of his work in magazines, but when I saw this show, it just completely took me away, and my whole style changed. I came home and I put away the watercolors, the acrylic, and I started with oils. And I went from doing, at that time I decided from doing flat traditional to wildlife to basically more to almost landscape, to try to show the world itself bigger than any individual. I put small figures on these massive landscapes, and I was also painting on a small scale. When I decided after that show, I decided I was going to go more figurative and expressionistic and basically surrealistic. I have to also add, at that same time, I'd had an opportunity to see be introduced to a lot of Salvador Dali work. And between Plitka and Dali, I was just completely blown away, and my whole style changed, and I went to oils and on a large scale, large canvases.
How about your current materials? What kinds of materials do you currently use and why?
Well, the oils were short-lived. I used oils all the way up to 1984 because that's when my daughter was born. And I've always had the studio in the house. The toxicity of oils, plus other things you already have in the studio, it was a concern. So I packed my oils up, thought I'd try acrylics, and I discovered you could use acrylics that come close to the same, some of the same use, not really the same values, but you could come close. And using them, and so I went to acrylics, and to this day I still use acrylics. I like the oil. I like physically moving the paint that you do with oils. I like blending with hands, blending, physically feeling the buttery substance. But I also don't like that drying time. Like a lot of artists, you sell out to that idea versus a full year to actually wait to varnish. If you want an acrylic is done as soon as it dries in 15 to 20 minutes.
And I think you mostly use canvas, but occasionally you use board. Is that correct?
Yes, I prefer canvas. I actually prefer board, but it's a lot slower. When I use board, I still use the oil techniques because I used oil on board a lot, and I like that glazing, and it's a slow buildup. But board, when you get to a certain size, weight becomes and warping has a problem. And so canvas is good. I like canvas. I still do some pen and ink on paper and just little things like that, but canvas is my favorite.
Can you describe your creative process, beginning with how you generate ideas?
I'd say I'm probably more of an idea and look in search of a vehicle to get the story out. I'll say I'm one of the lucky ones. I'll die not having been able to put out the different things I'd like to be able to put out. I keep two different little books. One of them is basically titles, and that's the book of that title will tell me what I need to say, and the other one is a story or stories, and then and that story is in search of a title, and the painting will, when it's finished, will get the title. If it's when I finish a piece. The inspiration comes just from the human experience, and I think it comes all artists, regardless, even if they're painting, doing a painting of a rose, they're being driven by something that says a statement needs to be made about this, and it's a frustration that you feel that somebody hasn't made that statement yet. So that's why the originality. I think that's where originality comes in. So when I do a piece, the first thing when I finish, I ask myself, what was I wanting to say? Then you say, okay, did I say it? And if that passes that much, you go, was it worth saying? And for me, the bold thrust of my work, ever since I started, since I started painting, was basically to try the frustration of everybody of this separate but equal that we've always had in this country, little diverse argument and underlying things, conversation going on. And we're all the same tribe, just different clans. And my lineage is the proof of that. I'm a mix of so many different cultures. Yet as an artist, I stand alone in the fact that I don't belong to any of them in my mind. And I think as an artist, that's where when you become an artist, that's the line that you actually cross. And I think that's, you're going to get more than you asked for on this one. That's where I think that the Indian art world itself is hitting a crossroads now. And I think that it's our generation who has helped bring it on. Sadly, for some people, they may not like the concept of it. But for me, I think we're the perfect generation. That me and a good friend of mine, Merlin Little Thunder, had this conversation about the fact that we are the generation that actually has ties to what the elders, or what we call the old timers, who actually lived a lot of what we're trying to portray. We have still touches with it and brief glimpses of it, but it's still not. It's not that solid ground and footing environment, tribal environment. Those days, in my belief, are pretty much gone in the fact that we're removed from actually living a day in, day out existence of that tribal identity. We have it, and we still have ceremonies, but we're not in that environment. And that's why I think we're at that crossroads now where we want to tell the younger ones, okay, it's time to go beyond the buffalo hunt. I don't paint buffalo hunts. I've never been on one, will never be on one. And I think that we're to the point now to step beyond that. And I think that's where the Oklahoma artists have always pushed that envelope. And hopefully we'll continue to do that.
That's a timely comment for me, because I was going to talk about the fact that a lot of your images are, drawn mostly from the 19th or early 20th century, seem to be. That you don't do, for example, historical depictions from the 50s on. And why do you like painting subjects and props from these earlier periods?
They're the perfect vehicle for the psychological environment that I wanted to frame. I've said it before, and I still use this analogy when I'm at shows. I'll tell people, all I'm doing is building doors with these paintings. Mm-hmm. And if I do it right, decorate it, you'll open the door and you're going to go someplace that I don't even get to go. But that's what art is. It's not that flat image you look at. It's where you get taken. Where I want it to take you, all I want to do is set the atmosphere of where you're going. And you're going to end up figuring out the details. And the environment is that more of a mystical. At time when we saw the world as being a little bit bigger than ourselves. Now in this 21st century, and actually into the 20th century, information comes at us so fast that we have lost a lot of the awe of life and the fragility of it and the sacredness of it, because of information being so, we think, always at our fingertips. And information does not always give the full scope of what we're looking at or trying to understand.
I'd like to talk about your sometimes you have actual historical figures, and other figures in your paintings seem to be more symbolic or like prototypes, like the shaman figure, for example. And you sort of touched on this, but I want to ask again how much story or narrative is important to your work.
I think it's the whole work. I've told people before, if I can get by with just putting a circle on the canvas and make you understand that's the creator, and it's about humility, being in front of the creator. If I could get by and if I could sell that, I'd probably do that. It doesn't work. You have to have a little more window dressing than that usually. And back to what we were previously we were talking about, is that using the figures of that basically time frame of when we still have that setting of mysticism, and that imagery seems to invoke that in people. If I were to put a doctor with a stethoscope, a scalpel, it would make you think of a sanitary or possibly somebody of knowledge that is going to do something for you, but it doesn't give you the awe and that feeling of something different, something really special taking place. So if you give them the concept of what we mentally think of it. When you say the word shaman, you don't picture somebody, or if you say medicine man, you don't even picture somebody with a stethoscope. People automatically revert back to this, even, and that's not just American culture, it's in any culture. They'll go back to that almost frozen in time imagery of what shamans look like. And when we want to invoke that concept, we also have to remember, why did the shamans incorporate all the utilitarian things that they used? And it wasn't because that maybe that shaman thought that that feather, when he touched you on the head, was really going to cure you. But if he made you think that it was going to really be beneficial, he had access now to your thoughts and actually maybe help in healing you. That's what we do as artists. I think we use them. We paint those feathers in there. We put that stuff there to bring you into that, where you're receptive to what we're wanting to say. And for me, that's what those vehicles are.
Are you ever influenced by topical issues or by current politics, whether it's dominant society politics or tribal politics?
Yes, to a point. I think that I don't like to beat a dead horse, so to speak. You can you say what you have to say and move on, because you can. I did just recently. The most recent thing I did that was more along those lines was I did an anti-war series, and that's actually started from our first Gulf War, and I culminated with our last one, and I'm lucky that was kept basically intact by Arkansas University. They have the whole collection, and I don't need to visit that again. Simply for one reason: give another 10 years, there'll be another war. There'll be another reason for somebody to say war is bad. I don't need to keep saying it. I know it is. We all do. As an artist, I think you have a statement to say, and then you move on. In the Indian art world, I think that's one of the jobs some of us older ones have now, is getting some of our younger ones past that point of political commentary. If it's going to be political commentary, let's make it contemporary, and let's don't fight the wars of the 19th century.
Following your conversation here, just kind of changing order, because you're touching on a lot of the things I was hoping you would touch on. There are certain themes in your paintings that, an observer notices right away, like there's an emphasis on spiritual and physical transformation or metamorphosis, on symbolic reminders of our mortality as human beings, and ceremony of various kinds. Can you talk about these themes?
Well, the main thrust of my theme to begin with, and like I said, was to say that we're one tribe. We're the same tribe, just different clans. And when we tend to forget that when we get caught up in a lot of the politics. Because of that, the one thing that you asked me about getting into contemporary political views of things that are going on, current issues and current events, is that I think that's something that's reoccurring. And because it's always reoccurring, we have to have a main philosophical bent to our work. I think every artist has it. And one thing that I want to point out is the fragility of life. A Blackfoot chief once said it best. I liked it simply because he said, in reflecting on human life, life is but a firefly in the night. And we tend to forget that the world is so much bigger than us. I mean, if anything, my grandfather taught me that, and it's that to see with the eyes of an eagle, but live your life as the mouse. The eagle sees the big picture, sees everything, but the mouse always sees everything bigger than itself and lives with humility. And is also the most ferocious creature we have on the North American continent as far as warrior and fighter. He's ferocious. And so I always thought that was a good analogy. And with that in mind, you have to tell people life is short. And no matter who your God, precious time is always ticking away. And to be spent in futility of war is or in such disagreement and in pettiness, it's a sad thing. And I think if we were reminded, we always hear the saying, take time to stop and smell the roses. Well, there's a lot to that, I think. And I think one of the jobs of the artist is either to paint that rose that you want to stop and look at, or paint the doorway that takes you someplace where that rose is at. And that's what I decided that I wanted to do.
Symbolism is an important element in your work. Can you talk a bit about your symbolic vocabulary, how you choose the symbols you use? Or
I think every artist is a symbolist. I mean, that's everything we put on there is to represent. I mean, we do everything with smoke and mirrors. I mean, at least the three-dimensional people actually create something. If it's curved, it's curved. You can physically touch it. As painters, what we have to do is we have to give the illusion of that curve. And because of that, we're always using that concept of smoke and mirrors that lets us know that we're on a footing. So because of that, everything we use is a symbol. And for me, like I said, I always, in approaching something, I always want to think, well, you try to get into a viewer's head. And you think, well, how am I actually going to make them open this door, go somewhat to the area I want them to go? And when you get technical, that's composition of the canvas. But before you even get to composition, you have to think of what will actually get them there. And one thing that I've always discovered is that there are certain things that we have that are unique to the human individual. That's what makes us human. And symbols is one of those that are identified across the world. And one of the things my grandfather said to me, and this is one of the last things he said to me, besides trying to tell me when I was going to the service to come home safe, but he also said to always remember, because he said you'll travel other places in the world in your life, and everybody understands a smile and a butterfly. That's one reason butterflies are prevalent a lot. I catch a lot of players ask me sometimes about butterflies. And that's my grandfather. But also, after that, after deep thought of that, this is a long-winded answer to your question, is that what really triggers people's thoughts? And why does a butterfly trigger their thoughts? Well, what is the representation of a butterfly? And then you start looking, do a little research, you find that artists throughout history have used the butterfly. And it always represents, what it boils down to is an act of faith of somebody. And so one thing we all have, as human beings, we have this faith, regardless of what your faith or religion. And for that, each faith has their own symbols. And that's where I decided I'd start educating myself on things. Well, this symbol represents this in this tribe. Over here, this symbol, well, it's a different symbol, but it represents the same thing as this. So I started deciding, if I want people to understand what I'm saying, juxtapose the symbols to each other and make them understand they equate. We're the same people, just different ways of expressing it. And that's where that whole concept of my symbology came from.
And I think there's probably already lots of overlap, and in a way you've sort of answered, but because I know that props, which always have a symbolic meaning in your paintings, are an important part of your painting, and I was wondering how much thought or time you give to like finding exactly the right prop, or perhaps the right scrap for the right prop, or
that's part of the major undertaking of every piece, and it's also the fear of every piece of because of that's why it's my job to try to figure these things out. Is that you go, I don't want to use the butterfly in every painting, so I have to find something else that equates to that, because if a narrative, an artist gives nothing but a narrative in their work, and we speak with the same voice throughout our life. So the idea, if you say the same thing over and over, it becomes just noise. So as the painter, you sometimes you can do it by changing your palette with your colors. For me, it's trying to find that new symbol, a new way of tweaking somebody, taking them someplace that they've never been before, or seeing something in a different view. So I spend a lot of time, I always say research. It can be daydreaming, it can be it can be reading, going through museums, and staring at canvases saying, what do you need to say what I want you to say? And the easy route would be to throw the symbol that you use over and over, and then that takes it, like we're back to that, it's the same voice, and so you want to give new words constantly. So it's very important, and I think it is that way for every artist. but it's just used in a different way. Like we're back all the same, just use different tools. Instead of using instead of putting a feather or an amulet, that they're worried more about the color or the composition. It's the same thing.
Talk about your friendships a bit with other artists and how these have played a role in your career or your life.
It's been a major one in a lot of ways. The first artist that really besides my uncle Wallace Hughes, and then Pat Gordon and Herb Robb, but the first artist that was basically I considered my contemporary was I was working with Linda Griever at the Art Market in Tulsa, and there was an artist by the name of Gerald Stone, and Gerald and I ended up.
Willard Stone's son.
No, Gerald.
Oh,
no.
This is a different.
Yeah, Gerald is actually Ben Harjo's cousin.
Okay.
And
Thanks.
And Gerald was a pen and ink man, but he had been trained at the Santa Fe School, and that's one of his paintings there. And he painted in that style, but he preferred pen and inks. And during the course of this showing at Linda's, it seemed like me and Gerald were positioned by each other quite often for several shows, and we struck up a friendship. Gerald was the one, he would critique my work, and he'd tell me what I was doing wrong here and there, and a lot of it for laughs, but he also was the one who kept telling me to not listen to some of the naysayers at the time. In fact, at that time, the gallery wasn't happy with the direction I was wanting to take my work, because the other work was selling. They said, well, why do that? And at that was at the time Gerald started telling me I needed to meet another lady who had a gallery in Oklahoma City by the name of Doris Littrell. And I was with Linda for, I think, a couple of years. And lo and behold, during one of Linda's show, I got elbowed by Gerald standing next to me. He goes, that's who you need to meet. And Doris Littrell walked through the front doors. And that was the first time I met her. And it was about a year later that I ventured and met with Doris. And that was the new gallery. And through Doris's gallery, I got to be a lot closer with a lot of the other artists. I got to know Merlin Little Thunder a lot better. Virginia Stroud. Both of them became very big friends and influences, whether they knew it. Unbeknownst to them in a lot of ways. Our style is so totally different. But I've always, when you talk to the young ones, and a lot of people, you can tell there's craftsmen, and this is another topic I'd like to touch on a little bit about as far as Indian art world. But there's craft, then there's painters, and then there's artists. And I've always been more intrigued ahead. I've always admired, placed them on high pedestals, the craft. Master craftsman, for some reason in this country, all of a sudden got a bad title to it. And especially in the Indian art world, because we took the word craft and we made it something we thought was a backhanded compliment. But master craftsmen, I've known a lot of them, and we see a lot of them. And their technical abilities are beyond reproach. They're just magnificent. But then there's the artists, and those are the ones the ones that I started wanting to become friends with, and that was Merlin, Virginia, Ben Harjo. Some of the other people that I found Gerald Stone was, I can't say enough because what Gerald, the year and a half to 2 years I was around Gerald, the man really pointed me in a lot of ways and helped me a whole lot of things. But there's that move towards that and those friendships with those people that made a big difference for me. And then with stepping out, when I started moving outside of the state, meeting artists that were outside of the Indian art world and talking with them. That was a major coup for me in a lot of ways. So Frank Howell was one of them, who taught me in a weekend in the stockyards in Fort Worth, Texas, at a Stockyards Hotel, taught me how to do some things to this day I use. Whereas if a lot of established artists, you ask them how to do something, it's like you'd ask for their firstborn at that time, and they guarded their little secrets. And that is because of the Indian art world has been, it's actually a smaller smaller world than a lot of people realize. And so you get to knowing everybody, and everybody starts thinking they have a little hook, and that's in the arts. You think you have something that you're known for, and you don't want somebody else using it. I discovered that there was the true artists don't worry about that.
How about relationships with collectors? I know, they're complex and complicated, but sometimes they actually turn into types of friendship where you're actually, you're interacting outside of art. How important have those been to you over the years?
I think they're the necessity for any successful artist. I think the galleries and collectors, the galleries groom for you. That you get a base of collectors, a gallery that you will never get any other way. They get to knowing you in a different way, and through that, friendships are struck that complicate business to a degree, because some of these collectors become such good friends. You hear the complaint, "You never try to sell me anything," because it is awkward. Nobody wants to sell a friend. Then again, sometimes you don't want the friend to ask about a piece because you'll have to sell it to them at a discount. But it's imperative. It's those friendships and those collectors. I always say collectors are frustrated artists in their own right, and they start their own. Their art is the way they build their collection, and through that is their palette becomes not just the artist, but the artist, how the artist approaches things and their view of the world. And through that, you can't help but garner friendships, because when you have people of like mind, and a lot of collectors, you've discovered that they became interested in you because of the way you view the world. I try to tell young ones, as a craftsman, which you have to become before you ever become an artist, you have to learn your craft. You will have a following that will admire you for that, for just the way you put something down. I said, but artists are not paid for that. I said, the artists are paid for their view of the world, the lens that they see the world. And it's just like the craftsman will paint the flower the way the flower looks. The artist will paint it the way it smells or feels. And that's the difference. And collectors know the difference.
In 1980, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act was passed, and basically, in addition to protecting, from like pots made in Japan that were labeled Cherokee pots or whatever, Cherokee pot that wasn't a traditional pot, it required that artists who claim a particular tribal affiliation, provide proof of enrollment or CDIB or be certified by their tribe. How do you remember? Do you remember how this affected some of the galleries or individual artists? Or
yes.
Here in Oklahoma, that was a pretty major thing.
It was a firestorm. It really was. It was something that I think that I can argue both sides of it. It both helped the industry and hurt the industry. It helped in the fact that it made people stop and really realize what they were actually putting out as far as subject matter, content, and quality. And so that was a help. Where it hurt was, it comes back to where you're presenting that you're selling a bloodline versus art. And it's a fine line, and that's where we start running into the problem now, especially now, in that we're back to what I originally was talking about as far as I don't paint buffalo hunts, because there aren't buffalo hunts. Now, we have a collector base who want that romantic view of a time frame that people have frozen in this country from 1850 to 1890. And that is all of a sudden become the definitive Indian experience. And which is great if you're going to do a historical piece, really research and do it correctly. And there are a lot of people who do that very well. But if you're painting the way you view the world, and to make it to where, for a piece of art to be relevant, in my view, and from what I've read, as far as a lot of critics would say that 50 years after it's executed, is it relevant to any point in time that's taking place, anything contemporary? And a buffalo hunt would not be relevant. Now, it'd be historically relevant, but how many people have already painted? And that's where we get to the artist is wanting to move beyond that. If you're going to paint the buffalo hunt, it's going to look different. It's going to be complete. It's not going to be that 1850s look. That law put a lot of people afraid to step outside of what was considered Indian. And it started, I think, making a lot of artists pull back of what they were doing. Then the new movement in the 90s started really pushing the envelope again. And I give credit for the northern tribes for that, more Canadian than American, deciding that they wanted to be known as artists and not, they didn't want somebody coming just for the Indian experience. They wanted somebody to get an Indian view, but also well executed, something that would stand the test of time. We learned our craft, and if we want to present ourselves in a tribal viewpoint, we have to have a grounding of what that tribal viewpoint originally was. So that, therefore, I give credit to that concept of, if you're going to be involved in this industry, know a little bit of what you're talking about. But once you go beyond that, if you're going to have a tribal group, if say, we've all known, a lot of artists who paint strictly a tribal affiliation work. I admire a lot of people who do that. But I also have a problem in the fact of, if they have to be approved by the elders of that tribe of what they are actually putting out, then we're saying, okay, we're going to bow. We're not giving the artist free thought. We're going to bow to this concept of, we want to protect something. And which I understand that, the protection, but you can't be protecting something you're trying to market at the same time. Because then, if I just have a problem with that. And so as artists, I think we're observers. We're not a member of anything. I think the artist in us will always say, we observe, and we're going to document what we observe or how we feel or see it. I admire those who edit it for reasons that I understand. Now those people, that's the people who do the tribal affiliations, that I understand that concept of it. But to have somebody who, like right now we have a group of the Cherokee who are doing a preservation, they're purifying different things. They're just Cherokee and what's not. It's from such a convoluted tunnel vision view that they have frozen what the word Cherokee actually means. And I think to be any tribal group is also never stops you from having free thought. And there's not a group now. I always tell everybody, I have an ancestor who is a Blackfoot that somewhere met an ancestor who was say Osage. They didn't talk the same language, but they could communicate. And soon as they communicated, they were no longer truly just Blackfoot or just Osage. Because anytime you have two cultural groups meet, they're never the same after that. Because you borrow automatically from each other. Because if you don't, you die. The society die. The originality of the bloodline for the tribes was to kill the tribes out. Because if you go by bloodline, strictly, if blood quantum, eventually you have so many birth defects because it becomes so incestuous that the tribe dies, or it becomes watered down. There's no tribal affiliation because there's not the bloodline quantum that has to be met. And the tribes bought into that, and that's why this law also bought into it a lot. It was a mischance of people trying to control something that they really can't control. They should have tried to control it in the way they marketed things versus the way that it is actually viewed. Sad to say, at the time that law was brought in, probably your most accurate painters were non-Indian of Indians. Because I think most of the non-Indians were so concerned about historical work, they had frozen the time frame, but they actually did research and tried to put it out there accurately. Versus a lot of the native artists at that time was what our elders had taught us, the old timers, who had been masters of knowing what the tourist would buy. They were painting their own view of life because they had lived it, but they knew how to decorate it so the tourist would buy it. Then they had a group of paintings, which was their faith paintings. Whether some of the groups were Native American church, or it may have been of whatever ceremony of the tribe, that tribal faith, those were the paintings that were done for the artist from the heart. Those are the paintings that I find are just fascinating. Those are the ones that aren't really frozen in time thought-wise. They're frozen in time imagery. That's what the imagery I borrow from, because it's the faith base that brought that tribe to where it was at that time. And they know. My grandfather, a good artist, and I'll say friend, he wasn't a good friend because I didn't know him long enough, but Doc Tate never quite. A lot of us know his famous outburst at one time was, "We lost the war, get over it." You can't live in the past. You use the past to project something good for the future. And that's why, as Native artists, we borrow those symbols. We still paint the people running around with the feathers in their hair. We still paint that because it's to invoke an environment. But if the message is only that this is what took place in the 1850s, then it's not going to be relevant. And for the young ones, we need to push them past that. And I think that law sometimes hinders that.
Are there any other subjects you'd like to cover or comments you'd like to add to this interview? Anything we didn't get a chance to touch upon?
I'm very honored that you give me the time. I can't impress enough. I think that hopefully, if this is ever viewed, and sometime whatever artists viewed it, they're talking about a time frame of what we did, me and my contemporaries, what we were doing now to push beyond the being formatted as strictly Indian artist. I joke around. I just had a business card made. I said, I've been a full-time artist for 25 years. I've been doing art for 30-something years. I said, I finally had a business card made this year. I said, I've been doing it for 30 years, so I figure out that's what I'm going to do for a living. I said, but I jokingly, I say that, but I actually originally made a business card when I was first started working with Linda Griever, and she told me I should get one. And she told me I should have it, Indian artist. And I had it printed up. And before I actually could issue any of those, I went to a show at a local, Bishop Kelly had Fritz Schoder was there, an artist, who was giving a exhibition and a lecture. And I watched him paint a painting. He did an exhibition like he did this lecture. And when it was all over, I went up and introduced myself to him and talked to him. And the one thing he impressed upon me, in which he had his critics about, that he would no longer call himself, he said, I would not call myself an Indian artist, I'm an artist. I happen to be Indian. At some points in time, I use Indians as my imagery, but not always. He said, I'm an artist. I threw those Indian artist cards away. For one reason, he definitely impressed on me, and I to this day think it's true. As soon as you say Indian art, you devalue your work in the art market by 20 to 30%. That's been one of my goals of saying that we're not selling a bloodline, that we're selling art, not a craft or blood. And I want the young ones to understand that, and saying that not to pigeonhole yourself. Because you got to remember the collectors, a base of collectors who want us to stay there. And it's a love-hate relationship. They love the idea that they maybe collected a piece of art, got it very cheap, but now it's valued at this dollar amount. They like that concept, but they don't like the idea of paying this value now, and at some point in time it will maybe be worth more, maybe not. But that's not why you're supposed to be buying art. But you hope as an artist that your value will go up. But I find that that's the dichotomy we have going right now. And that's why I think at this point in time we're seeing it in the Indian art history of that the argument of craft versus art, of non-Indians painting Indians. It came up at Indian Market here in 2010. That was one of the political events of Indian Market in Santa Fe, which I happened to get in the gallery I was in. I got thrown into that, trying to stay aloof of it. But the truth of it is, I think it's time that is the Indian world, we have to confront this. We are going to have to put a dividing line and define what is actually craft and what is actually considered art.
And if it's art, it shouldn't require a proof of Indian identity.
Right, that right there. Craft, you definitely need to show. If you're saying this is a Cherokee basket, this is a Kiowa, this is a Arapaho, Cheyenne, then it better be grounded in that. You better be able to show that's what it is. Just like if you're going to say something's American, somebody's going to throw an American flag in there or something. Well, you better throw something in there that's of that tribal affiliation to show it. But if it's art, art is free thought. That if I was going to say what the definition of art, I was once told the definition of art is creating something that wasn't there before. Taking something and making something totally new and different. If you do it twice in a row, it doesn't value the fact that it may be magnificent looking, but if you're going to do it like manufacturing, it becomes craft. Should not devalue that thought. But the original thought, the first one, is really truly the one that's going to be worth more than the one that's number 1 million that's being produced by mechanical means or even by hand. With that in mind, the free thought concept, I think that it's free thought. It's that concept of being tied to no nation, no religion, not bound by anything other than the experience of the individual and the observations of that individual and putting it together. Because you're going to offend somebody.
Okay, you want to talk about that part, Robert?
The title of this piece is Ghost Story. This is one of the paintings basically that I've done that is basically a historical piece. It deals with the ghost dance movement. The seated figure with the hat is Wovoka, the Paiute prophet. And there's 12 figures. We're back to the concept of symbology. I found this canvas interesting in that I was trying to figure out a way to encapsulate a whole movement, the largest religious movement among the American tribes. It only lasted 2 to 3 years, and try to sum it all up in one canvas. And so what I approached it as, it was a religious movement. So there's 12 figures, and they represent the idea of the 12 apostles. And Wovoka, who was this movement started in 1890, was raised by missionaries, and he tried to start a new religion by melding native beliefs with Christianity. And I found that is the true analogy of the clash of cultures, of taking what you hope is the best of both and melding to make a whole new entity. And in this case, it didn't work. So what we're talking about here is the idea of Wovoka and the 12 apostles, the idea of the Christianity. And the ghost story would be the skeleton figure that's coming out of the hat. Would be the concept of the Christ figure. And what was being promised was basically the Christian rapture. And what the outcome was anything but. And that was the whole, so the stories told the idea of the figures, all the people that were pulled in on the North American continent, all the tribes that were pulled into this, the whole idea of looking for a better way of life, and it ended in calamity. And it starts with the whole story being told with what was promised, which is at the foot of Wovoka, which was the idea of the second coming, communion with the Creator, and doing the sacred dance that would get you there. What the reality was what's laid at the tribe's feet, which was Pandora's box, and ending in calamity. And it's the story of clash of cultures throughout history on every continent. And I found it just a great vehicle for trying to say that we are the same tribe.
Thanks.
The title of this piece is simply Complex. And this is a good example of the way I approach my work, actually, in that I use the shield as a complete vehicle of trying to show people of how we are the same tribe. I repeat that over and over, and that's what my work's about. In that, when you see a shield, I want people to understand in the native mind what's actually taking place. In other words, it's back to that walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. And in this case, the title invokes the idea that it's a simple piece of leather decorated with feathers and some artwork on it. But really what it is to the owner of this is that shield, so a simple leather shield becomes a portal. The shield is around to remind him or her that the world is round. Also, it's a full circle. It represents the creation, the creator. Feathers represent the concept of higher thought. That's why the feathers in the hair, that you physically of the world, but spiritually and mentally you should always be of the heavens, always seeking the higher self. The artwork in this case, this is actually a crow shield. It's called the Rotten Belly Shield. It's in the Smithsonian. It was a famous shield that was owned by the crow. It was used by the chief named Rotten Belly. And this is his spirit shelter that's painted on there. Well, at the time in the 1820s, when the Rotten Belly actually used this shield, it was a thing to remind him of how to act. All bundles, anything, we tend to forget in modern society that all of our accoutrements we now earn by going out and purchasing them. We figure that we've actually earned them, that we have the finances to get them, so therefore we're entitled to them. There was a time in all human history, regardless of the tribe, all their accoutrements were earned through deeds. And those accoutrements were there to remind you of those deeds. So everything becomes a medicine bundle. All the clothes you wear, everything that you attach to you is a medicine bundle to remind you of thought and action throughout your life. And a shield was no different. A shield is just the perfect conveyance for me to try to explain to people the complexity that goes in to the human mind when we start using symbols. This piece is titled Stump Speech, The Great Relative and the Oracle. And this was born from, I've always admired Albert Einstein in the simple fact that I don't understand his science, he's far beyond me, but his philosophical writings, especially after the World War II, after the use of the atomic bomb, he wrote a lot of philosophical writings. And in one of them, during an interview, and this is I ran across this in a magazine, the interviewer asked Mr. Einstein of how it felt that he will be remembered for all these things that he discovered. And I was just so impressed. His answer was, the writer said that Mr. Einstein paused and gazed into the heavens and then looked at me and said, "I've discovered nothing. I've been lucky to be able to see what always has existed." And I thought that deserves a painting. So that's why that, and also in this article, they had a photograph of him. A lot of people know he was adopted by the Hopi Indians, and and he was given the name the Great Relative because of his theory of relativity. And in this photograph, you see some Hopi standing around him, and it is rather funny looking, I thought, but he's in full gray flannel suit with a full headdress, and there's his wife dressed to the nines in New York, whatever, and they're standing there and surrounded by these Hopis, and it just says the Great Relative. And because of that, that's what this painting came about. So I put Albert Einstein in the back, and with his own words saying that he was lucky enough to see what existed, I used the tribal members to give the idea of what was going on. And when you look at the figures, one figure, when you look at his tunic, it has the nuclear symbol in it, and that was the idea, that the learning of the atom. And he's also brandishing a weapon because, as Einstein had been afraid of, that was going to be the use of their new discovery. And that's something that all of them who worked on it were always saddened by the fact. And then we have here that what they really wanted to come around to was the idea of peace. So I put the pipe in there, which is the old, you can't get much more, what's the word I'm looking for, say the peace pipe, because there's never such a thing, but it gives the point across. But here's the oracle, the hawk. Right here, the prairie falcon represents the oracle. And when you look, it's a stump speech because he's on the stump. When you realize he has his medicine pouch with him, but on the stump, carved in it is E equals MC squared. And it's as though Einstein has audience with the oracle, and that's where he learned it.
Oh,
I like the concept of my uncle once told, he said, you'll never discover a new color, you'll never discover a new brush stroke. It's just how you put them together. And that's what I think that basically what this whole painting's about. And so that's what it's about. It was a fun piece to execute.
thank you, Robert. And that is such a great story.